You're listening to The Conversation Weekly from The Conversation.
Autism is increasing in prevalence at an alarming rate.
This is Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Donald Trump's new Secretary for Health and Human Services.
Autism destroys families. More importantly, it destroys our greatest resource, which are our children. These are kids who will never pay taxes. They'll never hold a job. They'll never play baseball. They'll never write a poem. They'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted. And we have to recognize we are doing this to our children, and we need to put an end to it.
RFK Jr.'s portrayal of autistic people in this way caused outrage, and his claims are not backed up by evidence. Still, he pushed on, and in April announced that he was launching a new study of what causes autism.
This is a preventable disease. We know it's an environmental exposure. It has to be. Genes do not cause epidemics. They can provide a vulnerability. You need an environmental toxin.
Kennedy's claim that autism is a preventable disease with an environmental cause contradicts a body of research that suggests autism is caused by a combination of genetic and external factors.
By September, we will know what has caused the autism epidemic, and we'll be able to eliminate those exposures.
Kennedy promised to find a cause for autism in just 5 months. To support this rapid research study, he announced that the National Institutes of Health, the NIH, would partner with Medicare and Medicaid to build a data platform involving data on claims, medical records, and consumer wearables. The NIH defended the decision as fully compliant with privacy and security laws, but autistic people and disability advocates have voiced alarm at the potential violations such a database, which has been called an autism registry, could enable. Today, we're speaking with Amy Gator. She's a research associate at the University of Cambridge in the UK, where she studies disability surveillance. Gator, who is American, talks to us about why the Trump administration may be targeting autism now, and how disabled people have learned to evade surveillance in the last 100 years or so. She also gives some suggestions of what everyone can do to protect their sensitive data as governments increasingly gain access to every aspect of our lives. I'm Gemma Ware, and this is The Conversation Weekly, the world explained by experts. Welcome to the podcast, Amy. It's really good to speak with you today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
What was your reaction when you first heard reports that RFK Jr. planned to create what people called an autism registry?
It was shocking in some sense. It wasn't shocking given how much we already knew about RFK Jr.'s views, such as, being against vaccines, some of his views on not wanting fluoride in public water supply. So it seemed very on brand for what he was saying. I was surprised the degree to which he really wanted to systemically create this registry, and to announce it so publicly, I was quite surprised by that. And the singling out of autism, I think, is quite interesting culturally and socially and politically. It says something about the US in particular, about why autism in particular and not cancer, or something that we do have, massive rates of that actually are linked to very poor health outcomes, rather than autism, which many autism advocates say is a difference that doesn't necessarily need to be cured, but needs to be supported. And a lot of his claims also flew in the face of 30 years of autism science.
And did it affect you particularly?
I think in some ways, yes, it was quite upsetting. I have a lot of friends in the US who are autistic. It's something I've definitely been tested for myself in many ways. I would call myself neurodivergent, very publicly so. So I do see this autism registry as a larger attack on ultimately mental difference. And again, not a mental difference that is something that could lead to serious self-harm or lead to poor health outcomes, but a difference that in some ways challenges the status quo. And I have some ideas about why maybe autism in particular is this touch point for RFK Jr. and the Trump administration. It has a really complex history in the US in particular about how it's been embolized in this figure of a white, nonverbal, middle class, cis het boy. And their almost tragedy there is like you're losing another, quote unquote, good white boy. And it reduces really the complexity of autism as something that, of course, affects people of all races and of all genders and manifests very differently. So I think, I can almost read autism as it's usually portrayed as like this crisis of the American family, like this is something that's tearing families apart, which seems to be very, again, on brand with the Trump administration's moral panics about, the loss of the American family.
Fascinating. The Trump administration subsequently actually denied that it was creating an autism registry, and it said instead that it was bringing together databases into what it calls a real-world platform to allow researchers to study comprehensive data on people with autism for what it says is the first time in the US. What do you think would be the outcome of that bringing together of databases?
Yes. So from what I understand, the databases will primarily be from Medicare and Medicaid, which are going to be, off the bat, extremely limited. So that was kind of one of my first crisis moments in hearing these things. The other thing is that, autism is really hard to diagnose, especially for adults, because those diagnostic procedures are just not as well established because so many have been designed for children. And again, so many have been designed to look for a specific set of symptoms in ultimately white cis boys. And autism diagnosis, even with insurance, is really expensive. So they're already getting a really limited data pool. So if they were to, let's say, find a cure for autism, I don't know what that would look like. I don't really think I would trust it by any means because it is primarily we understand to be a genetic disorder. It would only affect probably a small population. And it would allow them to say, oh, we cured autism. And then there would be these millions of families with autistic children or autistic adults who still needed resources and support and couldn't get the kind of diagnostic processes that they need to be actually recognized and legible to the state, which would, of course, affect things like their employment. We know that's a huge factor for autistic adults. They struggle to find employment, but also affect their capacity to get certain kinds of disability accommodations at work or in public spaces.
Do you therefore see there being any such benefits to this effort to bring all these databases together?
I don't see any immediate benefit for the actual autism communities or the families with autistic children who are trying to raise their children in a nourishing environment, especially because, like we said, if this is some kind of genetic disorder, then what does that mean for the level of intervention that would have for the state's authority of this curative project? It reminds me a lot of this term that comes up in disability studies from this great scholar, Ijong Kim, who studies modern Korea project she calls curative violence, which is when the state or some kind of organizational body displays this cure as this magic fix-all or some kind of forced rehabilitation project to give an image of progress. Right? But the actual people infected, for them, it is a violence. It is an eradication of their way of being or a suppression of their way of being, which I think would be more likely in this case. And this is what I've been thinking about quite a bit because there is a pretty long legacy, especially with, the ongoing histories of eugenics, of these kinds of state projects, right? And it would look very good for RFK Jr. to say, oh, we cured autism, even though for many people in the world that would sound horrific.
I'd like to talk a bit, if I can, about the context of this and the history of autism diagnoses in the US. How has it changed, even in your own lifetime, of how diagnosis works?
Yes. So, of course, autism is, as a diagnostic category, it's rather new. The first person diagnosed with autism, he actually just died, I believe. I think there's a few things, autism really used to be separated into categories where being autistic and having Asperger's were two different things. And this actually comes out of Nazi Germany eugenics, where Hans Asperger didn't have a word for autism, but was interested in separating what he understood to be like good autistic children and bad autistic children, which was someone who's autistic and really smart, then you have Asperger's. or you're someone who is autistic and by traditional measures, you don't have the same degree of intelligence, then you have autism. And he used different words. But, Asperger's is still a term that we still hear. It's actually still used in the UK in some diagnostic procedures, actually, quite controversially. And there's some tension in the autism community about whether you choose to call yourself autistic or whether you choose to say, I have Asperger's. And most people don't realize this, eugenic history. So there's still these kind of persistent categories that are in tension with one another across different medical systems. The tides are turning, I would say, and most people in the US at least now use the term autism spectrum disorder, which is such a kind of beautiful, broad way to describe the manifold ways that autism really can manifest, but also the ways that autistic people are socialized differently, and that leads to their autism manifesting differently in terms of symptoms for them. And I think there's, a few things going on now, especially where autism testing is getting increasingly accessible. It is still quite expensive. So you do have large communities self-diagnosing using various sorts of online tests. There are many kinds of autism communities in the States and elsewhere that use terms like community affirmation. So rather than going to a medical system, which carries all this baggage because the autism diagnosis is still quite prohibitive, actually, especially in immigration laws. Many people will have these self-diagnosis communities and really understand that to be, really legitimate. And this is a larger practice, I would say, across a lot of disability communities today because of dwindling medical systems, but also because of increasing distrust of medical systems and the diagnostic categories they've created.
Every week, Michelle Grattan offers you a ringside seat to the latest in Australian politics with interviews and insights from political insiders. On the Conversations Politics with Michelle Grattan podcast, we cut through the spin and get to the substance with independent analysis of the issues that really matter. Stay informed, search and follow Politics with Michelle Grattan wherever you get your podcasts.
Amy, let's dig down a bit more into your research now. You look at disability surveillance in your work. Are disabled people and autistic people already being monitored and surveilled by the US healthcare system?
So I would generally say yes. I would maybe step back because I think surveillance is a term that a lot of people use in so many ways. And I would say that collecting information that you consent to giving is not surveillance, right? So if my doctor needs my blood pressure, I don't think that's surveillance. But if my doctor is looking at my social media profile or ordering unnecessary tests for no reason, trying to get into my personal life beyond legitimate medical reasons, I would say that's surveillance. So very broadly, surveillance is this collection of information for uses that involve the surveilling power to use that information in some way to control, manipulate, or otherwise access non-necessary information about the surveilled person. And, sometimes it can be difficult to know the difference between information collecting and surveillance. I think that is important to consider. And I think this is also what a lot of conspiracy theories ultimately come out of tracking who has the COVID vaccine or something like that, which is a legitimate public health initiative, versus tracking, people's pregnancy cycles, which is not a legitimate public health initiative.
Yeah. So what do we know about whether disabled people are being surveilled with that definition you've just given?
So I think increasingly as health systems become digitalized, a lot of different actors come into play. And this increases the chance for manipulative uses of that data and information. So in the UK here, Palantir, I think in 2023, won a huge contract with the NHS, our National Health Service, to be able to control and access all of our data and manage it. It was like £330 million deal. Palantir is, of course, infamous for working with the US on surveillance and military contracts and has been very big on policing the US-Mexico border wall and arming ICE with a lot of information. And Palantir has recently had a deal with the IRS in the US. And I think it's inevitable that Palantir could very likely also play a role in the US medical system based on current trends. But there are other big tech companies. So once we have those other players enter, your health data becomes a lot less secure. And for disabled people who really rely on the medical system and have these complex histories with their doctors and a lot more vulnerable information, we'll say, than someone who is able-bodied, an able-bodied person who also may elect to not go to the doctor for whatever reason, for a physical, etc. Disabled people are especially vulnerable to those things. And this is where I think a lot of room for surveillance comes into play. It is also the case that in the US and the UK, we already know that there's a lot of surveillance on people that claim disability benefits by the state. And there's been a lot of work done on this, in particular by legal teams to look at that. But increasingly, that is also becoming digitalized, such as accessing the bank records of those people, which is a current bill that's going through the House of Lords in the UK here. Or in the US, there's even things like large insurance companies hiring private investigators or doing AI-driven social media surveillance. In that case, I would call those things surveillance ultimately, because you're not knowingly consenting to your private life being privy to all of this.
Have you ever personally experienced what you would call surveillance?
Yes, and this is actually how I got really interested in this topic. I saw my medical records for the first time when I was 22. And I saw it on accident. And I was in the doctor's office. I think I was complaining about anxiety or something like that. I was incredibly anxious. And I saw the doctor and I looked over his shoulder and I saw the computer, and he was writing all this ridiculous, unnecessary stuff about me that I had never consented to giving, that I didn't think was true, that was going on my medical record. So he was talking about the quality of my hair, how fast I was talking. What? He was making inferences about larger things I was saying. So if I was saying, oh, I'm really anxious because of my job, he'd be like, patient has economic insecurity. And I was like, I don't have economic insecurity. It's a busy job. So that's when I became really fascinated in this question of what is in my medical records, right?
Was this in the US this happened?
In the US, yes. In the States, they don't belong to you. You have to purchase them. And it's really difficult to be able to control them, actually. It's a long process to get anything stricken. So my anxiety diagnosis, which is a legitimate diagnosis I have, came to predetermine so much of my medical experience in the years to come. I had this severe nerve disorder in my leg, and I just could not get an MRI. I could not get them to take me seriously, and they continuously would tell me to do things to calm my anxiety. And it turns out there was another reason that was actually causing that issue that took a very long time. So this has led to myself and other people going through this long process of trying to get things stricken from your medical record, because that is a manipulation of the information that's there. And that is what I think constitutes it as surveillance, when it's over-determining your medical experience and your actual voice is suppressed.
Yeah. So that's, I guess, one route that people are doing to try and counteract this surveillance. But what else are disabled people doing to avoid surveillance happening to them in the first place?
Yeah. So I think this is one of my kind of working theses in my research as to why there hasn't been tons of work on this, is that there's a long history of disabled people never having privacy, in a sense, of never having privacy in the same way in the kind of Western liberal tradition of I am an autonomous individual and I have a right to privacy. But disabled people have long been denied that, which we can see in the history of forced medical testing, the history of forced sterilizations, various laws that criminalize mental illnesses and put people in asylums, or even thinking about in the late 1800s to early 1900s in the US, there was a group of laws called the Ugly Laws that would ban quote unquote unsightly people and beggars. And at that time, a lot of beggars were disabled people or anyone with a facial difference, right? So there's a way in which, they've always been subjected to this history of intense staring. There's a lot of really great scholarship that examines this. So I think this is the larger context. And I think this is why a lot of these everyday actions that disabled people do to resist surveillance don't even come across as anti-surveillance, right? To them, it just comes across as this is how I exist in the world. Yeah, so I mentioned briefly self-diagnosis. I think this is a strategy I see increasingly happening, especially as states threaten to use medical records in this way. It becomes more and more of a trade-off, really, to have a diagnosis. Because let's say you have a bipolar diagnosis. On the one hand, that can get you access to important treatment, that can get you workplace accommodations, all things that are very good and important to the stability of your life. But on the other hand, that can also lead to some ostracization that can affect your ability to emigrate from that country and to be accepted by another immigration system, like New Zealand, Australia, are especially really strict on this.
Particularly on autism, you mean? Or?
On autism, yeah, like there's a chance you could be accepted, but it really, puts you at risk, really, because you're seen as unproductive to that society. And often, what these immigration systems want is like, are you going to be a good, productive member of society that's going to add to the economy?
So self-diagnosis kind of gets you around that by it not being on your medical record, but you being part of the community.
Exactly, yeah. So you have that level of self-diagnosis, which can be very beneficial, but as I said, at great costs, and it's not available to everyone, like as someone who's like, no, I need this medication to get by on a daily basis. But I am surprised how many people are increasingly taking that route.
I just wanted to go back and just ask about this question of if you were to hide your complete diagnosis from a doctor.
Yeah.
Because you could make the point that actually sometimes a complete medical history isn't technically surveillance. It could perhaps be necessary for treating somebody or understanding their needs. How do you make that distinction about when it's surveillance and when it isn't?
Yeah, I think this is when, patient consent becomes really important, informational consent, in terms of what information you would like to give, what information you would like to receive from your doctor. I think a lot of medical surveillance is coming from a place of crisis, right? Where there's a lot of pressure on medical systems. They are understaffed, they are overloaded, and the easy fix there is automating a lot of things or outsourcing labor to various kinds of digital systems. But as a result, you have shorter times with patients and you cannot explain things in the same degree of time. And I think this is an important distinction when it's like the patient may not know if this is surveillance or if this is just information giving. And this can create a lot of distrust, right? So this is when I think it's very important for doctors or nurses to have dialogues with patients about like, I am using or I am drawing from this diagnosis because of these reasons versus, oh, I see you have anxiety and I have 5 minutes left to see you during this visit. So I'm going to say it's anxiety. So I think this is the larger premise as to what's giving way to a lot of surveillance is efficiency in a crumbling system.
Are there other tactics disabled people are using to get around possible surveillance?
So I think a lot of these tactics have been around really strategic uses of language. Another one is people being very particular about how they describe themselves to certain people, I think is a big one. So that might be, instead of saying like, I'm neurodivergent or something like that, you might use a term that's less loaded to get you out of various kinds of ostracizations. This is also the case in workplaces where you don't have to inform your boss of your specific disability. You just need to ask for accommodations. Or one thing I've been looking into more and more is when I moved from the US to the UK, I had the option to not transfer my medical records. So I said no, and I refused all of them to be transferred so I could start fresh. And that was a great privilege in many senses, but it is something that I think while people have the advantage of it, I think it's a quite unique opportunity, again, to be able to go into a medical situation and not worry about how the rest of your medical file is going to overdetermine your experience there. But there's many other tactics. One during the pandemic, but obviously still now, is people double masking. And this is one thing I found really interesting in particular. When the pandemic broke out in the US and ultimately around the world, we had a big string of protests after the death of George Floyd and against anti-Black police brutality more broadly. And, people would come to protests with masks on. And those masks actually became really important because facial recognition software could not identify people as easily. So that was, I think, very important. But that has another life actually in disability communities where a lot of autistic people or people with facial disfigurements liked to wear masks because it meant they could walk around freely and not feel like people were staring at them, people were going to treat them different. It was a lot more comfortable social experience for them. I think most now are still doing it for health, but I think there was a double advantage there where they're also doing it in a way that allowed them to escape a lot of just routine surveillance as well as routine social stigma.
Okay. So I guess this is an example of the surveillance not really just being limited to health, but it's being part of kind of an everyday
Absolutely.
experience for disabled people. Are there other examples in the world where disabled people are kind of trying to combat surveillance that aren't just related to healthcare?
Absolutely, yes. One I've been thinking about more and more is the world is increasingly relying on digital systems for whatever reason. And in my research, I try to think about tactics in which that reliance, can still happen when needed, but isn't totalizing to the point where it erodes public trust and it erodes social relations ultimately. So there's been, a lot of talk in disability justice communities in particular about what it means to have care webs, or what it means to have really strong social networks that allow you to evade various kinds of social institutions or digital systems. So, for instance, I'm thinking about reliance on various kinds of applications, maybe to, I don't know, track how you're sleeping or track what kind of food you want to get or whatever it might be. What if instead you did that with some kind of friend? Really small scale stuff like this. And this is also the case. I know a few people who also had some kind of computerized prosthetic, right? Some of those prosthetics, like they are unbelievably sophisticated. Some of them, they have Wi-Fi on them, right? So they're connected up to this orbiting set of satellites.
Oh, wow.
Some of them are really, really amazing. There's this gamer in London, actually, that has this small drone that's attached to his prosthetic arm that can fly. Yeah, they can control with his arm. Yeah, they're amazingly sophisticated. But it's also the case that, as these prosthetics get more and more digitalized, there's just more room for kinds of vulnerabilities. And there's also more room for this sense of dissociation of like, is this body part mine? When it has a branded logo from some tech company and somebody else can turn it off from 500 miles away. So in that case, I've heard increasing reports of people actually turning back to more traditional prosthetics that are not wired or digital in any way. And I find that quite surprising, but also a bit inevitable. I mean, they're a lot more affordable, but it is the case that I think that we will see a bit of a backlash on this kind of compulsive reliance on digital technologies. That at the end of the day, is it really improving your way of life? Like, these are questions that people may ask themselves. I've done a lot of work on targeted health advertisements. So advertisements that kind of pop up on your social media feeds and kind of diagnose you. Of like, oh, you need this app for your IBS or something like this.
So if you are targeted by an advert like this, it could be perhaps linked to a Google search you've done. So there's a surveillance element to that. Is that what you're trying to say?
Kind of. I mean, the way targeted advertisements work more broadly is it may not be a Google search, but it's more, let's say, Instagram. They collect hundreds of data points, a lot of which they infer about you. Right. So they infer, okay, you're, a 32-year-old woman, you live here, you like these sorts of things, you go here, you're always online, maybe you have depression. And then they just throw you an advert, right? And, there's a black box to this. There's a lot we don't know about exactly how these algorithm systems work. But we do know that medical targeted advertisement is a huge, huge industry. And if you look at things like TikTok, where you have all these kind of medical health trend fixes, right? It seems like it's really getting to people, right? There's something about the personalization of the algorithmic feed that says like, this is for you, that for some people may really be accurate. And a lot of these adverts have really kind of semi-deceptive actual designs, right? So it'll be like, oh, just like click here if you want to take a test and see how your family trauma is defined by these archetypes. Click here if you want to connect with other people that have schizophrenia. And then you're taken to this external website, or you're like, oh, I really want to take this quiz, or whatever it might be. I would love to see eventually regulation that pushes against it. I think that the more that people are really intimately linked to these algorithmic feeds, the more power they have over you to influence the way you think about your body and what kind of products you ultimately buy, right, to feed it.
Going back to where we began, if the US or any other country for that matter does end up creating an actual database of autistic people or neurodivergent people or people with any other condition, what tips would you give people to protect themselves?
Yeah. So I think the first thing I would do is, I always suggest people have some kind of printed file of their records. So it's not just on some kind of digital system. Because, with great data collection also becomes room for various kinds of manipulation. I would suggest people have a really good alliance with a doctor that they trust if they can, like someone who will advocate on your behalf in particular, because, the issue with medical records, right, is they're so hollow. It says, this person has general anxiety disorder. This person has depression. Here are maybe a few of their symptoms. It doesn't tell you their story in any meaningful way. It doesn't tell you how it affects them. So I think these are things that I'm increasingly worried about, is also this datafication of a population with a certain kind of medical condition greatly leads that population to being reduced and dehumanized. So I think there needs to be great awareness about building strong alliances with medical professionals, which may be difficult for some with a lot of anxiety towards hospitals or trusting them, absolutely. But ultimately, what I'd love to see is also more community-led coalitions. I'm thinking about this group of autism scientists. I think there's about 300 of them, and they've created this new coalition specifically to push against RFK's orders. I love those kinds of coalitions because it, again, is not producing a dynamic where it's disabled people being forced to advocate for themselves and for the legitimacy of their existence on a daily basis, how people can protect themselves. I think that in an era such as this in the US, it's increasingly becoming evident to me that people have to be really careful about how they reveal information to people and who. Maybe something where they're looking for accommodations elsewhere. My friend who's a disability scholar, they have this great concept called access thievery, which is about stealing access when you need it. So let's say you haven't come out as disabled to your employer for whatever reason, maybe you just lie. Maybe you just say, oh, I can't come into work today, I'm sick. And really, you just need a day to decompress, or you need to go to a medical treatment or something like this. And there might be strategic ways we have to work within these systems in order to steal what we need. And I think this is going to be more and more prevalent. Or I was also thinking about remote work monitoring software, right? So you can see are you online or something? And people have all these smart ways to trick that, right? Like putting something on the keyboard, or you have a mouse tracker, moves like this. I think, for the average worker, maybe sure, but I think for disabled people who generally are like, I need that time to rest, to have my medications, I can't get out of bed today, whatever it is.
So there's an element of deception
absolutely
involved there.
Absolutely, which I think this is, completely ethical deception in terms of getting what you need for your well-being.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Amy. It's been a fascinating conversation and some real tips, I think, for people to take away from it. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
The conversation asked Palantir to comment on concerns raised in this episode that the entry of it and other tech companies into the healthcare sector could lead to surveillance, particularly of disabled people. A spokesperson for Palantir said this misunderstands how Palantir and its software operates, and that they have, quote, no interest in the kinds of activities that are being discussed here. The spokesperson said, quote, we're not in the business of collecting, mining or selling data and are not building tools for the general surveillance of US citizens. We simply provide tools that help customers better manage information they already hold. In addition, the spokesperson said that Palantir is designated by law as a data processor, with its customers, including the NHS, the data controllers. They said that access to any data is dictated entirely by their customers, including for what purpose and for how long. That's it for this week's episode. It was written and produced by Katie Flood, with sound design and mixing by Eloise Stevens. Our theme music is by Nita Saal. I'm Gemma Ware, the executive producer. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, do email us at podcast@theconversation.com. We'd love to hear from you. You can also sign up for The Conversation's free daily newsletter wherever you are in the world by clicking on the link in our show notes. The Conversation is a non-profit news outlet dedicated to sharing the work of academic experts with a wider audience. If you like what we do, please consider supporting us at donate.theconversation.com. And please rate and review the podcast wherever you follow us. It does help us reach more people. Thanks for listening.